Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week's show was originally going to be about snakes and wolves. But as you can see during the interview, the snakes, worms, and dragons sort of took over. And we already had gone for an hour when I realized it was probably better just to save wolves for another day. So I re-recorded this introduction so that you'll know why we talking about wolves, but then don't actually get that far. So this show will be about snakes, worms, and dragons, and we'll do wolves another time. So sit back, relax, get your cup of tea, and get ready for this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, we have our regular guest, Kvelduflr Gundarsson, and we're going to continue our series on heathen animals. And today, we're going to do snakes and wolves. Over to you, Kvelduflr.
Okay. I'm going to start by talking about snakes, and one of the interesting things about snakes is that they're very, very common in Norse art. They're also probably the hardest animal in Norse art to set a definitive meaning on when they appear by themselves as decorations or as amulets. Ulfr Nessman commented about the intertwined snakes on the Mammon Harmon-Nispo that the interlaced snakes in a ring cannot be explained, being either a symbol of evil or fertility, or they have an apotropaic function. There's not really a lot you can add to that.
Can you define that last word, please?
Apotropaic, warding, magical protection.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so often we'll use the word worm, which is applied to both snakes and dragons. It's cognate to the Old Norse ormr. The English dragon word is actually a borrowing from the Latin Draco, but in the Germanic tongues there was no particular difference between the two. And the main difference when we're describing the worm in artwork is that the ones that have feet and sometimes ears are usually described as dragons. The ones without are usually described as snakes, but the bodies are always long, twining, and snake-like. Of course, in Germanic art, there is also a tendency to describe any critter that one can't identify as a dragon, but that's another issue altogether. And I'm thinking particularly of the Sutton Hoo shield decoration, which a lot of people call a dragon, and if you look at it, it bears no resemblance to a worm or an ormr. It's actually a fish, a very toothy fish, quite possibly a pike or something. But you'll still find people referring to this critter as a dragon.
Could it be an eel?
It's got fins.
Oh, okay.
It's probably not an eel, and if it were shaped like an eel, it would be a lot more plausible as a dragon or a worm, whereas it's not shaped anything like anything snake-like. Now, the cult of the worm already seems to have been pretty strong in Scandinavia in the Bronze Age, at least as far as we can tell from the probably ritual rock carvings, particularly in Denmark and southern Sweden, and bronze items such as the Danish Fordal tableau, which is a collection of small bronze statuettes, the centerpiece of which appears to have been a string-skirted woman or goddess who is either driving or leading a worm of some sort. It's got a vaguely horse-like head, but it's very, very definitely something snakely. And we think that it was either that the original had her in an animal-headed ship. We have the little bronze animal head figures. And the worm was probably either on the ship with her, or else possibly drawing the ship. We also have a bronze razor from Denmark, from Vestrup, from about the same time, which shows a pair of axe-wielding men or gods in horned helmets in a double horse-head proud boat, followed by a woman or a goddess, this time wearing a long dress rather than the little string skirt of the Fardal woman, but she also appears to have a largish snake on a lead behind her. The Grevensvenge tableau also shows twin men or gods with axes and horns helmet on one bronze plate, 3 female dancers or acrobats in string skirts, bending in a backwards arc, and a standing woman or goddess with her hand upraised to the side, and she too is mounted on a bronze plate, which shows that there was originally a second figure underneath her hand. P.V. Glove, comparing this to the Vestrup razor and Fardal tableau, concludes that the missing figure was most probably a snake, and again was probably being walked on a lead by the woman or goddess. Now, De Vries suggested that at this time, the worm may have been part of an underworld fruitfulness cult, and he notices that there's a very close link between worms and horses in Bronze Age Scandinavian art. And on the Bronze Age Nader Fulvreys razor, we see a scene showing a horse-headed ship, a horse with what appears to be a sun disk trailing at the end of a long mane, and a large worm with a similar sun disk in the middle of the body facing the horse. It looks as though the horse is passing the sun to the snake, and the whole picture is thought to probably show the sun's faring through the sky and then through the dark waters under the earth. It certainly emphasizes the closeness of the two beasts and suggests that they were both linked with the worship of the sun, perhaps as the chief embodiments of both the overworld and the underworld. Now, there's some discussion as to where some of this imagery, some of this cult might have originated. P.V. Glove was of the opinion that the horse and sun and the twin gods or warriors with the axes are Eastern, possibly from the steppes, and the snake goddess may have originated in Central Asia. He thinks that she is closely linked to the snake and earth goddess of the Cretan Bronze Age. And in the Bronze Age in Scandinavia, we had a remarkably wide trading range. We were trading amber in particular for bronze in both Central Europe and down in the Mediterranean. And in fact, the Mycenaeans actually established a large permanent trading post in southern Sweden and were later followed by the Phoenicians. We can also notice that the practice of carving the large ships on the picture stones started about the same time that there was a massive influx of amber in the Mediterranean and bronze in Scandinavia. So there's at least a reasonable chance that the Mediterranean influence might have made a contribution to Scandinavian Bronze Age religion. Now, the snake mistress, it's hard to tell from the surviving pieces exactly what was believed of her. But she certainly seems to have been an important figure, probably underworldly. We can't really tell whether she's an early Nerthus or hell-like goddess, or a healer, a warder, a witch, a figure of terror. Who knows? And unfortunately, we also don't know a great deal about the Cretan snake goddess, so we can't really gain much from trying to do too close a comparison there.
I would say the only thing that I've noticed is that the Cretan goddesses, or figures that may be goddesses, are usually holding the snakes by the snake parts, and I believe most of the Scandinavian ones, they have little leads or
they
copper
actually
collars.
have leads and collars. They're walked snakes.
Yeah, so there is a difference there in how they're being handled.
Yeah, now interestingly, there is a 8th century or so picture stone in Gotland, the Smith stone, which I'll be talking about a good bit, just a little later, And this does show a woman holding the snakes in her hands. But considering that this is, well into the late Vindal Age or so, as opposed to the Bronze Age, that's probably a coincidence.
Yes.
Now one interesting cross-cultural item that might support the Mediterranean-Scandinavian axis is the string skirt, which was a very popular item in the Bronze Age in Scandinavia, which the Fardal tableau woman and the dancers of the Grevensvænge tableau are wearing. And Elizabeth Barber actually traces this item from Greece, where it appears continuously from Aphrodite's girdle of 100 tassels, embodying the goddess's might of love and desire, to modern folk practices, and Macedonia, Scandinavia, and Serbia all show similar garments from about the similar time. Now, in Southeastern and Eastern European folklore, the string skirt or tasseled girdle is used for help in childbirth and conception. The string skirt rather went out of fashion in Scandinavia when the climate cooled down a bit for fairly obvious reasons. It really didn't provide a whole lot of coverage there. But certainly in the time and place spread, the string skirt or tasseled girdle does appear to correspond to the Bronze Age snake cult, which, to quote, I think it was the original Conan movies, a few years ago it was just another snake cult. Now it's everywhere, and it really was everywhere in the Bronze Age. But if there is indeed a link, it would certainly strongly support the suggestion of the mistress of the worm, and in fact the worm itself, already in the Bronze Age linked with womanly fruitfulness, might, and possibly the woman arts of healing and magical warding. Now it's also interesting because Northern Europe doesn't have a lot of very large snakes. The largest snake species that's native to Northern Europe is the Aesculapian snake, which was found at least up into Denmark and possibly southern Sweden, but certainly in Denmark till the middle of the 19th century. And a large male can get to about 6.5 feet long, which is a pretty good sized snake. It's as the climate cooled, its distribution was reduced in Northern Europe to occasional favorable microclimate pockets, but it's still around. And it's an interesting snake. The Greeks used it in the Temple of Asclepius as sort of a spiritual cat scanner. People would sleep in the temple, and the snakes would come and crawl over them and then communicate through dreams to either the sleeper or the priest what the patient's illness was and what the best treatment might be. In the folklore of Bulgaria and Serbia, it's believed to be the guardian of the crops in the vineyard. It's also believed to have associations with the shamans of the area, and likewise believed that when it reached a certain age, it would actually grow wings and become a dragon. So it, although there's no way to prove it, it is quite possible that these early Bronze Age worms were in fact Aesculapian snakes. And the Aesculapian snake is a very nice snake. They've been known for their docility for 2,000 years, which was why they were used in the temple. They're still available. They make delightful and charming pets if somebody is looking for a non-venomous snake that is appropriate to northern magical and religious working. Of course, we hear much more about adders in the literature, but adders are not really suitable for keeping as pets. They're slightly venomous. Not terribly venomous, but slightly, which leads to another kind of interesting thing about the otherworldly presentation of snakes in Norse culture. There are a number of references to snakes such as Jörmungandr, or the snakes that Snorri describes in Hell's Hall, as spitting venom, as being terrifically, burningly poisonous. And you have to wonder, where did this come from? because adders really are not that dangerous. Unless one is actually allergic to them, the chances of dying from an adder bite are pretty minimal. They're very shy snakes. And of course, everyone has heard of Gunnar or Gunter in Nibelungen dying in the snake pit. And you have to wonder, how on earth could Attila have possibly gotten enough adders annoyed enough to bite an adult man sufficiently to kill him? It's very dubious, but it was something that was deeply, deeply rooted into the legend. It was something everyone knew about, favorite artistic motif, because we had this idea firmly socked into our head that part of the power of the snake was its venom. And this wasn't an idea we got from the nature around where we were living. It's just one of our mysteries. Yeah, but the snake cult was certainly very strong in the Bronze Age. There's also some suggestions of a Germanic snake cult appearing in historical times. The Langobardic tribe, for instance, were reputed to have worshipped a god image in the shape of, quote, a viper. The worm appears several times on the Galahoo's horns, though we can't really tell, is it a holy beast, or is it an enemy of the gods that's being fought? The Galahoo's horn imagery includes a lot of things. For instance, the image of a three-headed guy with a goat who is almost certainly an Etin of some sort. So can't really tell there. But in the Viking Age, at least poetically, mostly the worm's being as a beast of death and destruction took precedence over its fruitfulness aspects, although we do, and especially when it comes to women's stuff, still see a fair bit of that surviving in the Viking Age. Now, in a magico-religious sense, from the Viking Age materials, the chief, and indeed going back to the Bronze Age, probably, if the interpretation of the horse and snake imagery with the sun is correct, the chief characteristic of the worm is that it dwells in the underworld. The worms that appear in Eddic poetry, such as Nidhöggr, Jormungandr, Fafnir, and the worms that gnaw at Yggdrasil's roots, are all shown as foes of the gods and men. Voluspa 38 also mentions the hall on Naustrandir, where the criminal dead go, wound about with worms spraying poisons out of their mouth. We have the description of the punishment of Loki with a worm apparently dripping horribly burning venom onto him. Again, this just re-emphasizes this view of the worm, which did not correspond to the natural Norse adder. However, our forebears were strongly aware that the underworld was a great source of might and that the worm shape was well suited for gaining that might. And we see this very much in the cult of Odin, who takes the form of a worm to creep beneath the mountain where the meat of poetry is hidden. In Grimnismal 34, he names the worms Ofnir, which means insider or possibly combative weaver, and Svafnir, which means putter to sleep or slayer, as two of the worms below Yggdrasil. In stave 54, as he's bringing Geirröðr's death upon him, Odin also identifies his own names as including Ofnir and Svafnir. Snorri also tells us that the dwarves were made from the maggots crawling through Ymir's body, and a number of dwarf names are also Haiti or by names for worms. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the worm, even more than the filfot, was the favorite decoration motif on cremation urns, which seems a little ironic in the context of practical pathology, since if you cremated someone, you know you're not going to see worms. But it's also been suggested by David Wilson, among others, that the worm on the urn was meant to be a protective device. It was meant to guard the context of the contents of the urn, as if it were guarding a burial mound, as we see with our Norse dragons, or simply attempting to ensure that the pot was not disturbed after burial. So the worm is often twinned with the wolf as beasts of death. In Brotolf Sigurðar Kvelduflr, Gothormer is given both worm flesh and wolf flesh so that he will be able to kill Sigurður Volsung. In Gisla Saga, Gisli foresees Vestein's slaying with two dreams. First, that an adder crept from a house and struck Vestein to death, and on the next night that a wolf ran from the same house and bit Vestein to death. We can also notice the two kin provings or initiations in Volsunga Saga, which Sigmundur puts Sinfjotli through. First, the poisonous worm in the bag of meal, which Sinfjotli has to mash up and make supper out of. And then secondly, the episode with the wolf hides, in which Sigmundur comes very close to killing Sinfjotli. And in fact, Sinfjotli's life is saved by probably direct Odinic intervention, by a raven coming with a leaf which is laid upon the wound in his throat to heal it. But in both cases, the trial brings Sinfjotli closer to readiness for helping Sigmundur with his revenge. And the Volsungs as a clan are clearly shown and strengthened in both these scenes as a kindred filled with the warrior and the deathly might of Odin. The one kinning for worms is Grave Wolf, suggesting the devourer in the grave. And in Scandinavian folk medicine, the name Helulven, Hell Wolf or Death Wolf, is sometimes used for several illnesses attributed to a worm creeping into the digestive passages, which might shed actually further light on Loki's three children, the wolf, the worm, and Hel, as three embodiments of death, if not necessarily battle death, and perhaps also suggest another element in which Loki's close relationship, his blood brotherhood to Odin, is very appropriate. They have much more in common than most people these days generally portray them as having. Now, I also suggested in the past that the imagery of Ragnarok, with the three great single combats, Odin against the wolf, Thor against the worm, and Freyr against fiery Surtur, mirrors the imagery of human death. And I should add that corpses left on the battlefield, which belong to Odin, more or less, are both poetically and in real life back in the day eaten by wolves. Buried corpses, which one could argue belong to Thor, or at least falling into the class of things done with proper rites and hallowing, are eaten by worms, and cremated corpses are eaten by fire, just as the earthly Freyr is slain by Surtur. So we, as well as being associated with death, worms are also one of the main embodiments of sickness. And there's basically four kind of main descriptions of pathogens and medical elements which appear throughout the Germanic medicine, at least as transmitted through folklore. Pathogens characterized as flying venoms and worms. Elves are extremely ambiguous, present both as healers and as sources of disease. And of course, the number 9 is very common for Germanic magic of all sorts, including healing magic. And when any of these appear in a remedy, that's a pretty good indication that it is at least partially a native remedy, as opposed to a copy or a translation of a classical remedy. And of course, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon leech books, there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of syncretism, there's a lot of use of Southern or classical medical text, together with the original Anglo-Saxon healing charms, recipes, and remedies. So it can sometimes be difficult to sort out the origins of any specific thing. But when you see flying venom, worms, elves, or the number 9, there's a pretty good chance that the cure did originally come from the Anglo-Saxon culture. And of course, if you looked at things from a more modern point of view, you might say the worm isn't such a bad image for defining and magically dealing with a pathogen of any sort, a bacterium, a virus, or a fungus. Although certainly infestation with actual worms, and in particular roundworms, was terribly common in the Viking Age, where a vast number of roundworm eggs in the cesspit of the York excavation, suggesting that pretty much everyone who lived in York in the day had worms. And of course, one would be prone to all manner of other illnesses, and one would sometimes observe worms coming out of the body, which would make it pretty understandable that we would see one of the main elements in healing as spells and herbal remedies to drive out the worm of the sickness. But as well as its source of sickness, at least in later Scandinavian folklore, worms also appear as a source of healing. In Telemark in Norway, there's a saying that snakes have 2 tongues, a poison tongue and a healing tongue. Of course, that which was poisonous was also often understood to be mighty in both magic in general and healing specifically, and we can think of some of the more serious medicinal herbs, such as henbane or deadly nightshade, which are indeed extremely poisonous, and also, when used by someone who knows what they're doing, don't try this at home, very effective remedies. The great Norwegian folklorist Reicborn Kinnerud particularly argues for the worm as strongly linked to healing in Nordic folk tradition, both as a healing item and as a symbol of the healer's wisdom, lore, and might. He mentions that snakes, like the raven that came to Sinfiotli, are thought throughout all the north to come with leaves of healing herbs in their mouths to show humans which are best to use on wounds, and that both live adders and various pieces of adders were a common part of the Scandinavian pharmacopoeia well into the 19th century. Now, interestingly, modern science has come back to this understanding with the ongoing investigation into components of snake venom as significant pharmaceutical discoveries. For instance, epiphybatide from rattlesnake venom and tirofiban from African saw-scaled viper venom are both used as preventatives for heart attack, and there's a compound called mambalgin from the black mamba, which is showing great promise as a major painkiller without the addictive and sedative drawbacks of the opiates. And there's many more venom compounds which are now being examined as well.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages.
Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Now, when we see the worm as an amulet, and we do see the worm in a pretty clear amuletic context, it's hard to make out what it's meant to do specifically again. but overall we can at least say that it seems to embody magical might. And it may be that with the double sickness versus healing being of the worm, the might that allows the baleful being to do harm could be shifted into a warding might, which, if we look at the worms in grave art, for instance, we can see how the image of the natural ravager of the dead might have been co-opted and controlled to protect the dead for ravagement. Although, curiously, there's no known lore suggesting that the Germanic folk actually saw the snake's shedding of its skin as a sign of rebirth or eternal life, as, for instance, the Mesopotamians and the Greeks did, because if there were any evidence to that effect, the meanings of the grave worms would be much more clear. They'd be an obvious symbol of resurrection, but, there's absolutely no grounds for thinking that our forebears were thinking that way. It's Birgitta Johansson suggests that the worm has the quadruple role of guardian, transformer between life and death, giver of wisdom and strength, and possibly a direct symbol of paganism. More interestingly, we have the worm certainly showing up as a symbol of birth. And this takes us back to that theory that the snake goddess of the Bronze Age may very, very well have been linked with this whole female fertility, female power thing that was certainly going on further south. In Gutta Saga, there is a woman called Kvitistjarna, who is the wife of more or less the founder of Gotland. And it says that the first night that she and her husband slept together, she dreamed a dream. It was just as if 3 snakes were coiled together within her womb, and it seemed to her as though they crawled out of her lap. She related this dream to Hafthi, her husband, and he interpreted it as follows: "Everything in rings is bound, inhabited this land shall be, we shall beget sons 3. So in this case, the snakes are the heroes, the sons of Gotland's founders, and more or less seem to represent the entire people of Gotland in the long run. Gotland is also where we find the picture stone from Smiths, which I mentioned earlier, known as the Snake Witch picture stone. And this shows a naked seated woman with a double knot hairstyle, which appears in a number of possibly magico-religious contexts. The hair is sort of knotted into a pretzel either side of her head, and she's holding up a snake in each hand. She's sitting below an animal-headed triskelion. There's also a picture stone from Sanda Samdegorda, 6th, 7th century Gotland, which shows a large snake twined in a figure of 8, flanked by 2 snakes in the same writhing position as those held by the Snake Witch on the Smith stones. And we have a very similar disc brooch from Gotland from the same period, with a similarly three intertwined serpents. Now, this was found in a 9th century grave, but the style suggests that it was made in the 7th century, passed down as a family heirloom, was obviously a very important piece. Was it amuletic? Well, there's no way to tell that. It might have been. It might have been just a nice piece of art. We always have this problem with amulets, unless there's something really known and obvious, such as the Thor's hammer or the coiled snake design, which is believed to be based on the ammonite fossils, which, again, I will be talking about very shortly here. But in regards to the close link in particular between worms and women, it's well worth noticing that a common motif, which appears in the tales of Ragnar Lothbrok, and also throughout Scandinavian folklore and stories, such as the Icelandic tale of the worm of Lagerfljót. And this is the motif of a maiden who raises a small snake, often in a chest or a casket, which is important because the woman's casket where she would keep amulets, herbs, precious objects, would have the key for, was a very important part of Germanic female culture, and of the woman's role as the mistress of the house, responsible for the health and well-being of the family.
This would be a casket like a basket, not in the modern sense.
This would be a casket like a small chest.
Okay.
But the maiden in the story, in any case, raises a small snake in a chest or casket. Often it's lying on a hoard of gold, which grows as the worm grows, until it becomes a huge and dangerous monster. And we might wonder, is this a late understanding of a root tradition in which women use worms, which might have been real, otherworldly, or amuletic, as a source of might, and possibly to be seen as a parallel to the male worm associations of the battle hero and slayer. Now, interestingly, two Viking Age finds, Birka Grave 632 and Ekatorp Nerica, include women's multi-pendant necklaces where a coiled worm ammonite pendant appears together with a throne pendant, which, if there was any intention in the juxtaposition, as opposed to just stringing up a nice necklace with every piece of jewelry you happen to have that was stringable, this could also suggest a link between the worm and womanly might and rulership. There's an interesting tale from Magnus Saga Hinsgoda Akerels Hardrada, which seems to show these understandings from a much darker view, from a Christian perspective, in which the benefits seem to have been transposed into a bad thing. A woman by the name of Ingebjörg, the daughter of Haldor, has drunken a small worm and suffered fever and swelling of the belly, which is actually compared to a difficult pregnancy as a result. The cure was to take her to a waterfall and let a small drop of water fall into her mouth, which eventually, with some saintly intervention from Olafur the Fat, lured the front half of the, again, venom-full snake out of her mouth where it could be chopped off. Now, when we compare this with the Gutta Saga account of the heroic worms in the womb and the folkloric worm in the woman's casket theme, and if you want to invoke Sigmund Freud here, be my guest, it's easy to read this tale as one of heathen womanly and fruitful might rewritten as a bad thing for which various forms of Christian intervention were the cure. And the worm's link with water is also pretty common. Worms were thought of as water beasts as much as land beasts, and the waterfall in this story in particular may suggest a special might. Now, it's interesting that the belief in the in-creeping worm causing pregnancy lasted into the 20th century in Norway, and again, Reichborn Kinnerud, who as well as being one of our main folklorists in Norway, was also a practicing medical doctor, refers to an article which appeared in several Norwegian newspapers in the autumn of 1921, in which it was claimed that an adder had crept into the mouth of a sleeping girl, causing her belly to swell in a manner mistaken for a pregnancy, until she was taken into the Rikshospital and an X-ray revealed the snake, and many efforts based on folk medicine were taken to lure it out in a manner very similar to the tale of Haldor's daughter. Now, in this particular instance, the worm was not, in fact, an adder. It was a giant roundworm, which is a common enough human parasite these days, and more common in the Viking Age. But the immediate folklore-based identification of the snake as an adder that the Norwegian newspapers in 1921 put on it was really telling about just how deep-rooted this motif was. Reichborn Kinnerud also likens the story to the torture death of Roither in Rami at the hands of Olafur Tryggvason by means of having a snake driven down his throat, which could quite possibly be suggestive of the worm as a symbol of heathenry, which was being used abusively by Olafur, as well as something that could, in the traditional Germanic understanding of the causes of illness, was believed to creep into the body and cause illness. Could also similarly, when we talk about in-creeping worms, treasures concealed in dark underground places, and women's power, it's hard not to think about Odin stealing the meat of Poitry. Odin, the one-eyed snake, creeps under the mountain, seduces the keeper of the mead, and comes back having gained the mead.
In southern folklore in the U.S., you have the motif of the woman who raises the snake, who eventually raises up and kills her. But there's even a folk song about that. But that's still the idea of the woman raising the snake and keeping it close to her chest.
And that sort of thing sticks. In Scandinavia, and particularly in Sweden, we had a belief in the house snake, the actual snake that was a familiar spirit, or, well, spirit-infused, inspired animal. It was a real animal, lived in the house, and it was considered to bring good luck and protection. And you would put down milk and bread for the house snake. This was, again, largely the woman's job. Similar folklore is also found down in Greece and the Balkan areas, but it was very persistent in Scandinavia. Most of the time, these would have been the Northern European grass snake. People didn't generally tend to encourage adders to stick around. And of course, the Aesculapian snake could not survive very far north of Denmark. But so the grass snake was kind of our default non-venomous snake back in the day. Interestingly, the bread probably served to attract the snake's actual prey. I was dubious for a while that the milk did anything else, but snakes actually really like milk. Pretty much everywhere that you have snakes and people, you will find bowls of milk being left out. And I know a herpetologist who was working in Australia. They had a large amethystine python who lived by them. And the snake had plenty of water access, but he would always show up like a racehorse when they put out his milk for him.
Aww.
Yeah, which may be again another possible link between snakes and women, because women produce milk, and a snake might well be attracted to come and sort of curl up in the warm source of milk area. Now for women, the worm seems to have been largely a source of might to be kept and raised in hiding. For men, it more often appears in the form of a challenge or a heroic trial, although we can also see the hero being linked with the worm by the fact that a common sign of a hero is his eyes glittering like a worm's or like an adder's, and that's described in Rigsthula, Völundarkvida, Arnbjarnarkvida. It's a very common comparison, and seems to have been as strong a way of describing heroic soul might as our forebears had, especially when one thinks on how often staring eyes were the sign and means of using spiritual strength. On the manly side, I've mentioned already the manhood and kin-proving trial of Sinfiotli with the worm in the meal. The link between the worm, the Volsungs, and the manly heroic challenge theme is carried on in the stories of Ragnar Lothbrok, where again we see the king's daughter given a snake or two snakes, depending on whether you're reading Saxo or Ragnar's saga version. The worm grows to a frightening size. In Saxo's version, they actually scorch the land with, again, this mysterious venomous breath that the Old Norse otherworldly worm has. Ragnar protects himself in, again, the details differ. In Saxo, he throws himself into freezing water and lets the cold turn it into basically ice armor. In Ragnar's saga, he just covers himself with the very shaggy breeches from which he gets his name and a woolen cloak boiled in pitch. But this is to ward him from the venomous blood of the worm, which is also, again, a fairly common motif in worm and dragon descriptions in the Germanic culture. He manages to defeat the worm or worms and gets his heroic by name from it, as he's still known today as Ragnar Shaggy Breeches. And this
Which is what Lodbrok means?
Yep. Which also recalls, again, more than passingly, the venom-proof skin of the Volsung Sigmundr and Sinfjotli. And for Ragnar, this is quite an appropriate initiation for the guy who, at least in Ragnar's saga Lothbrokar, ends up marrying the last child of the Volsung line, Aslog, who is, according to the saga, the daughter of Sigurdur by Brunhildr. And when she reveals her hidden lineage, having been raised by peasants, in the course of time, the proof of her claim to Volsung heritage is the fact that her son Sigurdur is born as a snake with a sort of birthmark in his eye, with the mighty deed of his grandfather, possibly assisted by the recycling of the name Sigurdur, seemingly having left its traces in the family genetics, and possibly the rebirth of the soul. By this time, the worm seems to have become, even more than the wolf, the overt sign of the Volsung kinmite, because, well, you just don't get any better than slaying a dragon. You just aren't going to get more heroic than that. Though interestingly, Saxo gives it a very different account of Sigurdur Ragnarsson's by name. He's known commonly to everyone as Sigurdur Snake in the Eye. Saxo's version is that when he is injured in battle, a very tall old man offers to heal him if Sigurdur, or Siwardus is the Saxo version, would offer to him all the souls of those men he would slay in war. And Sigurdur, or Siwardus, agrees. The old man cleared the infection with a touch of his hand, healed the wound, and sprinkled dust on the irises before departing. And it's described, spots unexpectedly appeared in his staring eyes, and the dust generated what looked like very little worms. An old woman who was there to give his potions looked once into his face bearing these little worm-like marks, recoiled from the youth in strange terror, flopped suddenly to the floor, and fainted away. Now, Saxo also suggests that the worms were placed in this hero's eyes as a warning of his future savagery, and if this is anything more than the usual Saxo moral commentary, it could be quite possible to read the worms here as specifically standing for the darkest aspects of Odin, as we see, for instance, with the Odin worm names mentioned in Grimnismal. There's also a close tie between worms and weapons, which may strengthen the manly, or at least martial, understanding of the worm as the heroic initiatory challenge. We see snake designs on spearheads, spear shafts. In skaldic poetry, both spear and sword are referred to as snakes. It's a very common element of kinnings used for either weapon. And the pattern-welded swords are described as grained with little snakes. And both Thithric's saga and Cormac's saga mention magical swords in which, if they are manipulated in certain ways, little snakes will be seen creeping out and crawling about them. And this is a very important part of the activation of the magical sword. Now, both sword and spear are literally long and sharp-toothed conductors to the realms of the dead, so the likeness to the worm is not only obvious and unavoidable, and we note that there's also a strong link in thought between swords and poison. Hilda Ellis Davidson, in The Sword in Anglo-Saxon England, mentions that the association of weapons with poison is found constantly in heroic literature. Her opinion is that It's been suggested that this was related to the practice of acid etching to bring out the patterns of a pattern-welded sword, but she thinks it's more likely a metaphor for the swords of extreme sharpness, and possibly reinforced by the image of the sword as a worm. We also see the sword as a battle emblem, for instance, on the Trajan pillar, where a Germanic standard bearer is carrying the image of the worm before the host. Stilicho's army had a purple serpent as a battle flag. The Staffordshire Horde contains several gold worms, and one of them in LM14 has a small flanger peg by which it might originally have been fastened to a piece of battle gear, as do numbers 128, 846, and 923. So it's a reasonable guess that the Staffordshire Horde worms fit into the groupings of battle worms as well. We also see a rider accompanied by eagle and raven with a worm at the foot of his horse on one of the Vindel 1 helmet plates. The eagle and worm also appear together on the Valsgardis 7 Warriors and Worms helm plate, where two warriors with eagle-crested helms and downward-pointed spears are each accompanied by a rearing worm whose tail starts at his rear foot and whose head comes to his elbow, and the foremost of these also has a raven flying up in front of him.
I want to break in just a second, because it has to be parallel observation. I don't think there's any actual connection, but the symbol of the Aztec nation was the eagle with a snake in its claws.
Yes, and we see eagles and snakes. Eagles and snakes are paired more often in the Viking Age. Eagles and fish in the Migration and Vindel Ages. But snakes and fish overlap quite a bit. However, the snake seems to have, to some degree at least, bet out the fish as the personification of the underworld by the Viking Age. In general Western culture, for various reasons, one often thinks of worms as associated with wisdom. We don't see that as a direct linkage in the Old Norse literary poetic sources, but we do see some hints about the worm as the keeper of otherworldly lore, both with Odin's use of the worm shape to gain the meat of skaldcraft, and the dialogue between Sigurður and Fafnir. Fafnir obviously has a great hoard of lore, which is worth Sigurður standing there and interrogating him for a while over. Once we get into later folklore, we find things like the wisdom snake in Faroese tradition, which can be boiled with meal to make a broth, and the one who drinks it comes to know more than other men. And this is part of the story of the Faroese folk hero Jakob the Wise, who is staying with a woman who is skilled in secret arts, has found a special snake which she recognizes as a wisdom snake, boils it up intending to give the broth to her son, and Jakob gets home tired and thirsty, sees the broth cooling, and he has the first drink. And this is very much reminiscent of Sigurður accidentally gaining the knowledge of bird speech from Fafnir's blood while he cooks the heart for Rayan. The same theme appears in Irish mythology, where the young Finn McCool is set to cook up the salmon of knowledge for his teacher, but burns his thumb on it, sticking his thumb into his mouth and gaining all of its lore for himself. In Norwegian folklore, we see something a little similar to the wisdom snake. It's a white snake which is said to be able to heal all sicknesses. And if the white snake were seized, supposedly 3 stars would come up in the water. The first would make one wise, the second would give second sight, and the third, which whirls about like a wheel, would drive one mad. Now, the white snake seems to have had a very special place in Scandinavian folk magical practice. It was considered, again, that eating it could confer magical power and wisdom, though it was also thought, again, in that double way that snakes have, to cause illness, and there were court cases in Sweden in the 18th century, where people were accused of using a white snake in curses. There's no actual native breed of white snakes in Scandinavia, but both albino snakes and leucistic animals are pure white except for their eyes, do appear much more commonly in Scandinavia than in more southerly points. So you would not expect to see a white snake commonly, but it does appear, and would have been a very powerful thing when one did find one. And Swedish folklore also links worms with folk touched by the other world. In the 18th century, it was believed that if one slew a snake with a stick, then laid it at the church's door, any trollkona, trollwoman literally, but actually meaning witch, would have to gape her mouth and could therefore be identified. There's another Swedish folk tale in which a changeling is told from her human sister by means of touching each with a snake while her back was turned. The ordinary girl shrieks, but the changeling says, "There is nothing to fear, it is only a hair from my father's head." Now, as we get into the Viking Age magical or amuletic uses of snakes, there are a few designs in the Viking Age that we can pretty reliably identify as amulets and that appear very frequently throughout the northern world. The Thor's hammer is obviously the best known, but the number 2 in terms of popularity is the coiled snake design, which is thought to have been designed after the pattern of a fossilized amulet. And in fact, there was one of these carved in wood found in Fishamble Street in Dublin, which was actually found with a real fossilized ammonite. It was pretty unmistakable. And these have been found in Dublin, England, Norway, and Sweden, with materials and quality ranging from pretty crude wooden carvings to very finely made gold and silver ones found in Norway and Sweden. Pendant fittings are pretty rare. Usually there's a hole right in the center around which the worm is coiled, and probably a loop was run through that to hang it. But some of them don't seem to have any means of hanging or other attachment, which really suggests that they were carried in a pouch as an amulet, rather than simply worn. Now, in Northern English folklore, the fossil ammonite is also called a snake stone, and this may very well be Viking Age, or at least Viking descendant, because Northern England is where most of the Viking colonists went. And the fossil ammonite itself was called a snake stone, and in that region, ammonites were believed to be snakes that were beheaded and transformed into stones by magical or holy might, and were very much considered in later folklore to be found amulets of great power, particularly against thunder and lightning. Now, we don't really know what it was meant to call forth. It could have been a warding. The coiled snake amulet could have been a warding thing, like the actual ammonite against thunder and lightning, or possibly against snakebite, or ill enchantments, or the various diseases characterized as in-creeping worms. They could have been overall bringers of luck, might, possibly even female fruitfulness. They could have had a specific cultic meaning which just hasn't survived, or could have been linked to the northern folk belief that certain wise folk had the might to enchant worms to protect them from harming humans. But whatever it was meant to represent or do, it was obviously pretty popular. And there's some reason to suspect that they might have been fruitfulness or birthing amulets. We've certainly found amulets such as the copper locket in Gotland with the coiled skeleton of a snake or a slow worm. This emphasis on the coiled creature in the closed space, which matches very nicely with Kvitstjarna's dream of the 3 snakes coming out of her womb. And if the embryos of many snakes are actually particularly live bearers, such as the Northern European adder, coiled up in a spiral. And in fact, if somebody were to cut open a pregnant female adder, you'd see this coiled creature with a large convex head, large prominent eyes, and a comparatively short body, looking slightly like a human embryo, kind of a long, squiggly human embryo, but very human looking, especially contrasted to what the snake looks like by the time it's born. Now, the main argument against the coiled worm amulet as a fruitfulness, pregnancy, birthing amulet is that there doesn't seem to be any folklore of the ammonite being used later in such a manner, which we would probably expect. The ammonite was usually an overall border, often against thunder and lightning, but the coiled snake pendants were certainly predominantly worn by women. The same is true for the Thor's hammer, and women in general seem to have been much more into the pendant amulet than men were. So of course, a great many other popular snake-shaped pieces of jewelry. There's a 8-shaped double-headed worm design, sometimes called an S-shaped brooch, which was incredibly popular in the Vendel period and afterwards. Many of the later bracteates show worms with birds' heads. And in terms of decoration, we also see, curiously, the Uplandic memorial runic stones of the 11th century, and these are curious because they're largely Christian stones, but the inscription often appears inside the body of a worm, and was this referring to the worms of the other world as warders of the dead, or just to show that the person memorialized was dead? Was it just a cool decorative way to set off the inscription inside the band? We don't know. It's reasonably plausible. For instance, the Ramsenberget runestone shows the huge twining body of the worm, long inscription, and a man piercing it with the sword. It's really probably Sigurdur slaying Fafnir, and there's a few other images on the stone which link in with that story. But the inscription doesn't have any reference to Sigurdur or any particular indication of why this motif was chosen, except that it was just really artistically very impressive. So that is pretty much all that can be said about worms.
And I think at this point, we've been going actually over an hour, believe it or not. So I'm wondering if maybe we should we save the wolves for another show?
I think we should save the wolves for another show.
Yes, and I'll redo the intro to reflect that we intended to get that far, but we just had so much wonderful information. So I want to thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we leave?
Not really. My snakes probably need feeding now.
Okay, well, we'll let you go and feed your snakes. And meanwhile, I want to thank all my listeners for coming this week, and I look forward to seeing you next time here at Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.